Greetings, brethren, and welcome to our presentation today, where we will discuss who decides our doctrines. Is it a committee of men or you? We'll look at some history and the origin and purpose of the Biblical Research Committee that is adopted by some of the Davidian associations, specifically Mount Dale and Waco. And we'll ask the following probing questions. For example, who determines a matter of doctrinal controversy amongst present truth believers today? Does the original Shepherd's Rod message have instruction to establish a Biblical Research Committee, BRC, after the death of Brother Howdeth? How does the BRC compare to the Seventh-day Adventist Biblical Research Institute, or BRI? What was the origin and purpose of the BRI? And finally, how and why did the Davidian associations at Mountain Dale and Waco adopt a BRC to settle their doctrinal controversies? So let us look at these inspired statements regarding the individual investigation required. We'll read this from Answer Book number 1, page 74. It reads, "But in all her history, the Church as a whole has never accepted a message from heaven. The call therefore comes to each individual member. Each must decide for himself. No one should allow himself to be influenced by another, and no one has a right to shut away the light from the people. When a message comes in the name of the Lord to his people, no one may excuse himself from an investigation of its claims. It was from pursuing this very course that the popular churches were left in partial darkness, and that is why the messages of heaven have not reached them." Testimonies to Sabbath School Work, page 65, Councils in Sabbath School Work, page 28. So here we see clearly that each individual member must investigate and decide for themselves any point of doctrine. There's no excuse getting around this. We cannot rely on another person or a committee of people to decide what is truth or what is taught amongst us. Or consider this from Testimonies to Ministers, page 69 and 70, about building up false theories. It reads, "But we see that the God of heaven sometimes commissions men to teach that which is regarded as contrary to the established doctrines, because those who were once the depositories of truth became unfaithful to their sacred trust. The Lord chose others who would receive the bright beams of the Sun of Righteousness and would advocate truths that were not in accordance with the ideas of the religious leaders. And when these leaders, in the blindness of their minds, give full sway to what is supposed to be righteous indignation against the ones who have set aside cherished fables, they act like men who have lost their reason. They do not consider the possibility that they themselves have not rightly understood the Word. They will not open their eyes to discern the fact that they have misinterpreted and misapplied the Scriptures and have built up false theories, calling them fundamental doctrines of the faith." Now, as Davidians, we apply this to the minister of Laodicea, but why can we not apply it to professed Davidian ministers as well? They are not immune from this very thing of thinking that they have the fundamental doctrines of the faith, but they have cherished fables. This certainly has to be true, because look at all the winds of doctrine that are blowing in our midst. So sometimes God does raise up people to teach that which is considered contrary to the popular doctrines, even amongst Davidian groups, as we will see. So let's look at Mount Dale bylaws. This is what they stand behind when they deal with controversial doctrines, and this, we'll read, comes from their 2016 bylaws, or Article 8, Biblical Research, Section 1A, quote, "Any doctrinal dispute or new interpretation contrary to the teaching of Mount Carmel in the field is to first be brought to the office of the Biblical Research Committee for investigation. before being disseminated to any group or field. 1SC 4, page 1. Notice in this bylaw what they are saying. They're saying that if any doctrinal dispute or new interpretation is contrary to the teaching of what? Mount Carmel, that is, Mountaindale. Not contrary to the original shepherd's rod, but contrary to Mount Carmel. And they defer it to the Office of Biblical Research Committee, not to the individual. So they've completely bypassed the teachings of the original shepherd's rod, but rather the teachings of Mount Carmel. And we're not talking Mount Carmel under Brother Houteff. We're talking about the new Mount Carmel at Mountaindale that started in 1983. None of them are prophets. So this language of this bylaw is usurping, as we'll show. Just look at the statement they use to justify their bylaw here. Symbolic Code, Volume 1, Number 4, page 1. And this was originally written in 1934, and it reads, "Do not weave into the shepherd's rod message your own interpretations of the Bible and of Sister White's writings, nor any of your constructions on anything that is written therein before first submitting your points to this office. If your claim on a subject, which you may hold as being correct, is found so and accepted as of value by this office after a careful examination, we can have it published and distributed throughout our ranks if that is your desire. But if we see no light in your verbal presentation or document of your claims, we shall so inform you as quickly as possible. Then, if you do not feel clear to yield to our judgment, be you pleased to know that we shall not attempt to block your way of teaching the same, nor oppose those who wish to read or listen to your discourses. Let every man be persuaded in his own mind." Romans 14, verse 5. So why do we say that Mountaindale's usurping this? Well, let's carefully analyze the statement. The office mentioned in 1 Symbolic Code, Number 4, page 1, was under the direct supervision of a prophet of God, Victor Houteff. In comparison, the offices of the current General Association of Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, that is, Mountaindale and Waco, are not under the direct supervision of a living prophet, but rather a committee of uninspired men. They're so-called BRCs. Notice this. So, by placing the responsibility that God gives to each individual to investigate for themselves to an uninspired committee of men, places the BRC above the individual and by definition makes them usurpers. What we find is that most people, including Davidians, follow uninspired interpretations of Scriptures. And this is so because in Timely Greetings, Volume 1, Number 5, page 14 tells us, man has long been exalting himself, so much so, in fact, that there are perhaps only a few Christians in the world that are really following the light of the Lord. Most of them are following the sparks of men, following uninspired interpretations of the Scriptures, devisings of men, men who scoff at the idea of inspiration. They see no more need of truth or of prophets, although they well know that the only truth that has ever come has been through the chosen servants of God. Even present truth believers have not as yet fully awakened to this startling revelation. Many of them are carried away with every wind of doctrine, much of which is created by impostors such as Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Numbers 16, verses 9 to 11. Coveting Moses' office, usurpers of inspiration's throne, taking sides, one for Paul and another for Apollos, as it were. Now, brethren, should we not apply this statement directly to these Davidian associations? Because even present truth believers have not fully awakened to this revelation that most are not following the light of the Lord, but rather the sparks of men, uninspired interpretations. And we have plain proof of this because look at the winds of doctrine that blow in our midst. All a laundry list of controversies about the new codes, who's antitypical King David, which pasture we're in, those with, and it goes on and on. What's the storehouse? Where's the headquarters? No one sees eye to eye. So it's proof in the case that most are not following the light of the Lord. Most are following the sparks of men. They're leaders at these various associations, and they're BRCs. So let's look at the origin of the BRC, or in the case, the history of the Seventh-day Adventist BRI, or Biblical Research Institute. Where did this thing come about, and what was its function and purpose? Well, in 1943, a committee of Seventh-day Adventist leaders formed for the express purpose to combat critics of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and the shepherd's rod was specifically called out by name. In 1944, this committee revised the book Daniel and Revelation by Uriah Smith, and we're going to see here shortly how that revision was for the intent purpose to destroy the rod's teaching on the stone in Daniel 2. We'll get to that in a minute. In 1952, the committee was given the name Defense Literature Committee, or DLC. In 1956, it reorganized as the Biblical Study and Research Group. In 1969, the Biblical Research Committee was formed from a merger between the Defense Literature Committee and the Biblical Study and Research Committee. And then in 1975, the Biblical Research Institute was established at the General Conference, comprised of a committee of resident scholars, and their purpose is to address any controversial doctrines. So whenever the Seventh-day Adventist Church has a doctrinal controversy, they go to the scholars at the BRI, rather than study it out for themselves. 1982 to 92, for example, the BR published a series of books called the Daniel and Revelation series by Maxwell in order to combat the new theology coming from Desmond Ford. So this is the type of work they do, and they have a website, and they publish articles on various positions, and that's when there's a doctrinal controversy, that's where the elders and the pastors go. They go to the BRI. They don't study for themselves, as they should, but they go to a committee of uninspired scholars. So let's look at this work of the book Daniel and Revelation. In 1944, this book was revised and newly illustrated, as highlighted in the box here. As we look in the cover leaf, it was copyrighted in 1944, and this edition came from the Southern Publishing Association. Now notice, this happened to be the very year that the Shepherd's Rod study chart in Daniel 2 came out. We're going to see what happened. But in the foreword, the publishers, the committee of scholars, placed the assumption that the doctrines in this revised edition are time-tested and therefore anchored on the solid rock. So that is, we can trust them, according to these scholars. That's the illusion, That's the mirage that they present, that this is a trustworthy book. But look what they did. Right here on page 65, at the bottom in the box in red, they insert 4 paragraphs that were not found in any prior edition of Daniel and Revelation, even editions that were published after the death of Uriah Smith. Uriah Smith died in 1903, and there was editions up to 1912. They were all the same, unanimous. So none of these paragraphs appeared in those earlier editions. And these paragraphs were directly quoted, as cited here, from Hippolytus, a treatise on the Christ and Antichrist, Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 5, page 210. And it's in these paragraphs that the teaching specifically came that the stone in Daniel 2 was Christ. And they came up with this new illustration you see on the left there of the rock or the stone coming from space. We'll look at the next page here we're rotated. So this is where the Seventh-day Adventist Church introduced the doctrine that the stone in Daniel 2 is Christ. right here. And they had this artist create this image depicting a totally false doctrine. It came from the Defense Literature Committee. Why did this happen in 1944? Well, it's a rather remarkable coincidence that this was the very year that the Large Shepherd's Rod study chart came out in 1944, copyrighted by Brother Houteff, showing plainly that the stone comes from the mountain, which is on earth, and that the stone represented the 144,000. So these people, these uninspired scholars, took it upon themselves to change the words of a dead man and revise his writings to make it appear that he supported the idea that the stone is Christ, for the sole purpose to contradict the teachings of the original Shepherd's Rod. Total deception. That's the work of the BRC at the General Conference. And they produced these anti-rod publications, the earliest of which, called the Warning Against Error, was originally published by the General Conference Committee in 1934, and then later republished by the Defense Literature Committee, and then the Review and Herald in 1955, after Brother Houteff died. They were trying their very best to extinguish the rod since Brother Houteff died. And they came up with this document, this larger book called The Teachings and History of the Shepherd's Rod, in their desperate attempt to extinguish the message. And this was published October 1955, about 6 or 7 months after Brother Houteff died. So this is the work of the Defense Literature Committee of the General Conference, the uninspired scholars, is to contradict the Shepherd's Rod. So why does the BRC that was adopted by Mountaindale not work? Well, we're going to give you the experience of what happened in 2002. At the Mountaindale session, a presentation was given warning about the danger of practicing spiritualistic health modalities of reflexology and iridology that were actively being taught and practiced in the camp. A 13-page documented study was provided for support. The initial presentation was cut short after about 10 minutes and deferred to a vote for the next day after all members had a chance to examine the written study, which was distributed. One of the ministers and major promoters of the iridology and reflexology made a strong appeal why these modalities were not dangerous and that, in the end, the matter was, quote, not a salvation issue. So ignoring all of the evidence presented in the study about the dangers of spiritualistic health modalities, it was swept aside. A motion was made to defer further investigation because a lot of people didn't know about these things, to defer further investigation to the BRC for a final conclusion. So a committee of 12 members were appointed, or part of the BRC. And after a period of time, only 7 replied. 5 of them in support of these modalities and only 2 against. And the matter was never brought up again. So the issue was swept under the rug and never dealt with. Well, I was a participant. I was one of those committee members. I was one of the 2 that was against these modalities. And I read all of the 7 responses. One of them was by one of the leading ministers, either Anthony Hibbert or Errol Stanford, pro-iridology, pro-reflexology. So it was their uninspired justification. The other 5 replies, or 4 replies in support, were utterly mindless. The people were parroting what their leaders were giving them and offered no evidence or honest investigation for themselves. So they were essentially worthless. Of the 12 committees, only one of them, besides myself, honestly investigated the issue and researched it and provided evidence warning that we should probably not be partaking in these things because of their questionable nature. That was Brother Adrian Prado. So out of 12 people, only one of them honestly investigated. I'd already done my research, so I was the other dissenting voice. So this is proof in the case how the BRC fails to function, and to issue this dangerous health modality, spiritualism, in the camp was never dealt with. So let's bring us up to the present controversy over the new codes. After a decade of near silence, Mountaindale has been forced to confront their support of the new codes at the recent 2018 session because brethren across the field in the world began to investigate for themselves and ask hard questions. They've been reading and watching videos challenging the authority of the new code sermon addresses. So Mountaindale could no longer avoid the issue as they've been. So the principal Mountaindale leader, Errol Stanford, was called out to defend the use of the new codes. And he gave it, and this was recorded on video and presented on Facebook, so this is public record. And he gave a very one-sided presentation that afforded essentially no opportunity for response from voices who questioned the authority of said codes. We're talking about Mountaindale supporters that had questions. They had no visible representative there to present the other side of the story, and their questions were largely sidestepped and put aside. In turn, Stanford produced a written paper that was sent around the world field, stating their defense of the codes. So this written document provided by Stanford's has been thoroughly refuted and utterly destroyed as a mass of uninspired dung. Yet all dissenting voices have been silenced for the time being. That is, people that were supporters of Mountaindale were basically muzzled. However, on our website, wayparish.org, please go there, we have responded to this document and exposed it as a hoax, complete and total hoax. So that shows you once again how the BRC is incapable of making a decision on a doctrinal controversy. It's an individual responsibility, not to be left in the hands of men. So what are our conclusions? At this time, during the scattering period, that is, after the death of Brother Howder from 1955 up until the execution of Ezekiel 9, we should have, where we have no living prophet in our midst, matters of doctrinal controversy should be determined on an individual basis, not by a committee of uninspired men, such as the BRI at the General Conference or the BRC at the Mountaindale or Waco associations. We should note that it is possible for a group of believers in this time to come together and agree on certain points of controverted doctrine that have arisen since 1955. For example, when New York reorganized away from Salem in 1983, they all agreed in their bylaws that were published at that time that, for example, that only 144,000 will be saved alive from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in opposition to the teaching from Donna Dare in Salem that there's going to be those with more saved alive than 144,000. So they were agreed on that by their own individual study. They also agreed that the living spirit prophecy was an inspired message, not a living prophet, contrary to the teachings of the Bashan and Bingham and Roden in the branch. They also agreed that Carmel is a spiritual pasture, not a physical location. So there is adequate precedent that people can, through their own individual study, come together and come to a unanimous consensus on certain points of controverted doctrine. So we don't need to have a BRC. Those who continue to depend on the BRC to make decisions for them will be subject to a curse, according to God's word, as it is written, Jeremiah 17, verse 5. Cursed is the man that trusts in the arm of flesh. Or Isaiah 2:22, cease from man, whose breath is in his nostrils. This concludes our presentation. If you have any further questions, comments, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, Universal Publishing Association. Or request copies of the original Shepherd's Rod publication for your own study, or any historical documents that you need for your own investigation and research. We'd be happy to provide them for you. Or to speak with a representative about this presentation or any other subject we discuss on this channel. Please feel free to contact us anytime. Our email, upa5453@gmail.com. Our telephone, area code 860-798-3672. Or visit any of our websites, upa7.org, shepherds-rod-speaks.org, or whyperish.org. We thank you for your time. May God richly bless you as you search for truth as for hidden treasure. Godspeed.